He was a real estate tycoon, accustomed to luxury and power, until a devastating crisis led him to bankruptcy. Without fortune or allies, he now struggles to regain his dignity. On a gloomy night, he witnesses a young mother being evicted from her home with her daughter. Moved by impulse, he intervenes, unaware that he's getting involved with a dangerous crime boss. As he tries to protect them, he faces not only criminals, but also his own past. Amidst the chaos, he discovers that his true redemption might lie in something money could never buy. The sun was setting over New York City when Richard Morgan observed his own reflection in the window of a closed store in the downtown area. At 45, his face still retained traces of its former imposing nature, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had known both heaven and hell. His suit, once impeccable, now showed subtle signs of wear, not enough to betray his current situation, but sufficient to remind him of where he had ended up. Just 18 months ago, Richard commanded one of the largest real estate empires in the country. His name was emblazoned on luxury buildings, resorts, and commercial complexes that stretched across the entire East Coast. Today, he walked the downtown streets with no particular destination, carrying only a folder with documents that proved his innocence, papers that, ironically, were worth no more than the plastic protecting them. Morgan Developments, the company his father had founded, and that Richard had transformed into a market giant, now belonged to Victor Sanders, his former partner and mentor. The same person who had convinced him to expand the business overseas just as the economic crisis was approaching. The same person who had secretly manipulated contracts and diverted investments, preparing the ground for his fall. "Mr. Morgan?" A familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. It was Mrs. Johnson, the former cleaning lady from Morgan Development's central office. "My God, it really is you." Richard felt his heart tighten. Unlike so many others, Mrs. Johnson had always treated him with the same respect, before and after the bankruptcy. Her kind eyes now looked at him with a mixture of joy and concern. "How are you, Mrs. Johnson?" He tried to smile, instinctively adjusting his worn tie. "Oh, my boy, working hard. I'm in 2 jobs now, you know. Since the company... Well, you... No." She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable mentioning the bankruptcy. "But what about you? I heard you're living nearby." Richard nodded. His current address was a small apartment in Brooklyn, quite different from the triplex penthouse in Manhattan where he had lived for years. "I'm adapting," he replied simply. "You didn't deserve this, Mr. Morgan. Everyone knows it was a setup by that." Mrs. Johnson stopped herself, looking around as if afraid of being overheard. "Mr. Sanders was never one to be trusted. We downstairs always knew." Her words touched a still open wound. Victor had been more than a partner. He had been a second, father to Richard, after his real father passed away. For years he had learned from him the intricacies of the real estate market, trusted his advice, followed his guidance. The betrayal hadn't just been financial, it had been personal, visceral. "Life goes on, Mrs. Johnson," he responded, trying to end the subject. But the lady wasn't finished. "You need to know something." She lowered her voice, moving closer. "Last week I was cleaning Mr. Sanders' office. I still work there some mornings, and I overheard a conversation between him and Mr. Harris, that lawyer. They were talking about old company documents, something about evidence that needed to disappear." Richard's heart raced. Michael Harris had been the legal counsel for the entire transaction that culminated in his loss of controlling interest. If there were incriminating documents... "Are you sure about what you heard?" "Yes, I am, my boy. And there's more. They also talked about an important meeting tomorrow at the Enterprise Tower. Seems like there are big people involved, government people." Richard felt his hands sweat. The Enterprise Tower was one of the last developments he had inaugurated before the downfall, a premium office complex in the heart of the financial district. Now, ironically, it served as Victor's headquarters. "Mrs. Johnson, you're an angel." He held the lady's hands affectionately. "I need to go now, but thank you so much." As he walked away, Richard felt adrenaline running through his veins for the first time in months. His mind, previously numbed by depression and alcohol, was now working at full speed. If there were documents that proved his innocence, he needed to find them. not for revenge but for justice, and mainly for his own redemption. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he almost didn't notice the commotion ahead. A small group of people had gathered at the entrance of an old residential building, raised voices cutting through the night that was beginning to fall. At the center of the confusion, a young woman held a child in her arms, while a man in an expensive suit gestured furiously. "You can't do this! My daughter lives here!" The woman's voice carried a mixture of desperation and indignation. "The terms of the contract are clear, Ms. Hayes," the man responded with professional coldness. "The deadline for voluntary eviction ended a week ago." Richard stopped, observing the scene. Something about that situation deeply touched his own wounds. He knew that type of suited man well. That tone of voice, that indifference masked as professionalism. For years, he himself had been like that. Richard approached the group, observing the situation more closely. The woman, who appeared to be about 30, held in her arms a girl who couldn't have been more than 5. Her green eyes, although teary, emanated a surprising strength. She was dressed simply, but there was something in her bearing that suggested her refined education. "Excuse me," Richard intervened, surprising himself. "What exactly is the problem here?" The man in the suit turned with evident irritation. "This is none of your business, sir. It's a private matter." "Hannah Hayes," the woman introduced herself, ignoring the man's protest. "And this is my daughter, Sarah. We're being evicted from the apartment where we've lived for 3 years, without any prior notice or legal justification." Richard felt something familiar about the building's name, Artisan Lofts. It was one of those old downtown buildings, the kind that used to be residential until they were swallowed by real estate speculation. His former company had negotiated several similar properties. "I'm Richard Morgan," he introduced himself, noticing a flash of recognition in her eyes. "And I believe I can help. I was a real estate developer." "Morgan?" The man in the suit suddenly changed his posture. "Richard Morgan from Morgan Developments." "Ex-Morgan Developments," Richard corrected, keeping his voice firm. "And from what I'm seeing, you don't have a court order for this eviction, do you?" The man hesitated, adjusting his expensive tie uncomfortably. "We have a contract signed by Ms. Hayes that I signed under duress," Hannah interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. After I was left alone with Sarah, Mr. Harris showed up offering a deal. He said I could stay in the apartment paying reduced rent, but he made me sign several documents." "Harris?" Richard felt his heart race. "Michael Harris?" Hannah nodded, and Richard began to piece together the puzzle. Michael Harris, the same lawyer mentioned by Mrs. Johnson, the same one who had actively participated in his financial downfall. "Sir," Richard addressed the man in the suit with an authority he hadn't exercised in a long time, "I suggest you inform your superiors that this eviction is not happening today. Not without a proper court order that has gone through all the necessary instances." Something in his posture, or perhaps the name that still carried weight, had an effect. After some frustrated attempts at argumentation, the man withdrew, not without making veiled threats about returning with reinforcements. "Thank you," Hannah whispered once they were alone. Sarah, still in her arms, had fallen asleep, oblivious to the drama unfolding around her. Richard nodded. "They'll probably be back tomorrow with more pressure. Do you have somewhere to go?" Hannah shook her head negatively. "All my savings were blocked. My family lives out west and I don't have the means to—" "I have an apartment," Richard interrupted, surprising himself again. "It's not much, but it has a spare room. You can stay there until we sort this out." "Why are you helping us?" Hannah asked, suspicious. "You don't even know us." Richard looked at the building, then at the sleeping girl, and finally at Hannah. "Let's say I know what it's like to lose everything overnight, and I also know how to recognize when something's wrong in a deal. Harris and his associates. There's more to this story than it appears." Hannah hesitated for a moment, but the sound of sirens in the distance seemed to help her make a decision. "So I need to get some things from upstairs. Sarah has medications that—" "I'll go with you," Richard offered. "Then we'll catch a cab to Brooklyn." As they climbed the stairs of the old building, Richard felt that something bigger was at stake. The mention of Michael Harris, the proximity to the Enterprise Tower, the conversation that Mrs. Johnson had overheard. Everything seemed connected in a way he didn't fully understand yet. In the small but well-kept apartment, Hannah quickly gathered the essentials in 2 suitcases. Richard noticed some details that seemed out of place: a valuable painting on the peeling wall, some art books in French, a photo where Hannah appeared elegantly dressed, next to people he recognized as bigwigs from the New York business scene. "Ready," she announced, holding Sarah with one arm and dragging one of the suitcases with the other. Richard picked up the second suitcase, noticing its considerable weight. "Are you sure you want to trust a stranger?" he asked, giving her one last chance to reconsider. Hannah looked deeply into his eyes, as if searching for something beyond appearances. "You're not a stranger, Mr. Morgan. I know who you are, and I know you were also a victim of them." Richard's apartment in Brooklyn was a stark contrast to his previous life. A simple 2-bedroom furnished with the basics, but clean and organized. As he opened the door, he felt a pang of shame, not for the simplicity of the place, but for having taken so long to realize that his old life was built on empty appearances. "It's not much, but—" he began to apologize. "It's perfect," Hannah interrupted, entering with Sarah still asleep in her arms. "It has soul." Richard led her to the guest room, which was actually his improvised office with a single bed pushed against the wall. "You can stay here, I'll get some clean sheets." When he returned, he found Hannah tucking Sarah into bed. The girl didn't even stir, exhausted by the night's events. In her sleep, her angelic face showed no sign of the tensions surrounding her. "She looks like her father," Hannah commented softly, stroking her daughter's hair. "Sometimes it hurts." Richard remained silent, respecting that intimate moment. After a few minutes, they both headed to the small living room, where Hannah finally seemed to relax a bit, sinking into the worn sofa. "Would you like some tea?" Richard offered. "Or something stronger?" "Tea is fine," she replied. "I need to keep a clear head." In the kitchen, while preparing the tea, Richard organized his thoughts. There was something about Hannah's story that didn't quite fit. The expensive painting in the simple apartment, the books in French, the photo with businessmen. And now, the mention of Sarah's father. He returned with 2 steaming cups, handing one to Hannah. "You said you knew me." Hannah held the cup with both hands, as if seeking comfort in its warmth. "Yes, I worked at the Artisan Gallery until last year. We organized exhibitions, cultural events. Your company was one of the main sponsors." "The Artisan?" Richard frowned. "But the gallery belonged to—" "Alexander Hayes," Hannah completed, an almost imperceptible tremor in her voice. "My late husband." The revelation hit Richard like a punch. Alexander Hayes had been one of the main names in the American art market, known both for his eye for new talents and for his connections with the high-level business community. His sudden death the previous year had been headline news in all the papers. I'm sorry," Richard murmured, recalling the event. "It was very sudden." "It was convenient," Hannah corrected, her voice now laden with bitterness. "For some people, at least." Richard waited, feeling that she needed to unburden herself. "Alexander wasn't just a gallery owner," she continued. "He was a born observer. He kept detailed records of all transactions, all events, all conversations he witnessed. It was his insurance, he used to say." Hannah paused, taking a sip of tea. "In the last week, he was agitated. He said he had discovered something big, something that involved several powerful people. He mentioned your name a few times, saying that you had been just the first victim." "Victim of what?" Richard leaned forward, totally absorbed. "I don't know exactly. He was planning to tell me everything the next day, but—" She swallowed hard. "That night, he had an accident with medications. The police classified it as an accidental overdose." "But you don't believe that?" "Alexander didn't even take medications," Hannah laughed humorlessly. "He was a hypochondriac, terrified of drugs. 2 days later, Michael Harris showed up at the gallery with a buyout offer. When I refused, the pressure started. Blocked accounts, problems with suppliers, even a surprise audit from the IRS. And the apartment? It was where Alexander kept his personal files, a safe hidden behind that expensive painting you noticed. Harris knew about it. The eviction is just an excuse to have legal access to the property. Richard stood up, walking to the window. The New York night shone outside, thousands of lights telling their own stories of ambition and power. "Are the documents still there?" he asked without turning around. "No," Hannah answered. "They're here." She pointed to the heavier suitcase that Richard had carried. "Alexander had a contingency plan. He taught me exactly what to do if something happened to him. 'If one day I don't come home,' he used to say, 'you'll know what to do.'" Richard turned to her, a new determination in his gaze. "And what exactly is in these documents?" "I don't know," Hannah admitted. "I haven't had the courage to open them yet. But whatever it is, powerful people will do anything to prevent it from coming to light. And now you're involved too." "I've been involved longer than I thought, apparently," Richard replied, a sad smile on his lips. "The question is, what do we do now?" Hannah stood up, going to the suitcase. "First, we need to understand who we're up against. Alexander left specific instructions about how and when these documents should be revealed. I think the time has come." Hannah carefully opened the suitcase, revealing a meticulous organization of folders and documents. On top, a sealed manila. Envelope bore only a handwritten date, March 15th, 2024, exactly 1 week before Alexander's passing. "He was always methodical," Hannah commented, her hands trembling slightly as she broke the seal. "Obsessive even, with documentation and records." Richard watched in silence as she pulled out a handwritten letter from the envelope. Her eyes ran over the lines and her expression changed with each paragraph. "It's a kind of map," she explained after finishing reading. "Alexander organized everything in codes and cross-references. He knew he was dealing with something dangerous." The letter detailed a complex scheme involving money laundering through art galleries and real estate developments. Alexander had discovered that several overvalued artworks were being used to justify fictitious investments in construction projects. "Morgan Developments," Richard murmured, beginning to understand. It was just a piece of the puzzle. Hannah nodded, pulling more documents from the suitcase. "Victor Sanders didn't just want your company, Richard, he needed it. It was fundamental to the larger scheme." The next few hours were dedicated to unraveling the intricate system of evidence that Alexander had gathered. Financial spreadsheets, contracts with dubious clauses, records of meetings, photographs of seemingly casual encounters that now gained new meaning. "Look at this," Hannah pointed to a series of bank transfers. "Your company started making heavier, cultural investments exactly when Victor assumed greater control of decisions." Richard examined the numbers, recognizing the patterns. They were absurd amounts for cultural sponsorships. At the time, Victor insisted it was important for the company's image, that we needed prestige in the art world. Meanwhile, the Artisan Gallery was brokering the sale of overpriced works, Hannah completed. The buyers were shell companies, set up specifically for these transactions. Clean money left Morgan Developments, passed through a circuit of galleries and collectors, and came back multiplied through phantom real estate investments. That's why Victor insisted so much on international expansion, Richard realized, the pieces fitting together. It wasn't just ambition. He needed operations in other countries to close the cycle. A soft cry from the bedroom interrupted the conversation. Sarah had woken up, disoriented in the strange environment. Hannah quickly got up to attend to her daughter, leaving Richard immersed in thoughts. When she returned a few minutes later, Hannah was carrying Sarah in her arms. The girl, still sleepy, looked curiously at Richard. "Who is he, Mummy?" "A friend," Hannah answered softly. "Someone who's helping us." Richard felt something strange in his chest upon hearing those words. How long had it been since someone had considered him a friend? How much time had passed since he had done something truly meaningful for another person? "There's one more thing you need to see," Hannah said after settling Sarah on the couch with her tablet. She took out a password-protected flash drive from the suitcase. Alexander kept video records of all important meetings at the gallery. It was a discreet security system that nobody knew existed. "And is there something specific on these videos?" "A meeting 3 days before the accident. Victor Sanders, Michael Harris, and 2 other people you'll recognize. They didn't know they were being recorded. Richard felt his heart race. We need a secure computer to view this, my laptop. No, Hannah interrupted. Alexander was clear in his instructions. This evidence can only be accessed in a controlled environment with appropriate witnesses. He mentions a name, Judge Marina Alvarez. Marina? Richard raised his eyebrows, surprised. She was my professor in law school, one of the few people who stood by my side after the bankruptcy. Alexander mentions her as the only one who can be trusted in the system. He left specific instructions for her to be the first to see this evidence. Richard checked the clock. Almost midnight. I can try to talk to her in the morning, but Hannah... He hesitated, choosing his words. Are you sure you want to go through with this? This is your last chance to back out. Once we open this Pandora's box... Hannah looked at Sarah, who was playing oblivious to the tension around her, then turned her determined green eyes to Richard. I'm not doing this just for justice or revenge. I'm doing it for Alexander's memory and for our daughter's future. Some truths need to come to light, no matter the cost. A noise in the street caught both their attention. Car headlights, briefly, illuminated the room through the window, and raised voices could be heard in the building next door. For a moment, fear flashed in Hannah's eyes. Don't worry, Richard reassured her. Nobody knows you're here. We have time to plan our next move. But as he said this, a part of him wondered if they really had that time. Somewhere in the city, that same night, Victor Sanders had certainly already discovered that Hannah's apartment was empty and that the documents he feared so much had disappeared. Morning arrived with New York's characteristic drizzle. Richard woke up on the couch where he had fallen asleep while reviewing documents. The smell of freshly brewed coffee surprised him. It had been months since his apartment had known this aroma. In the small kitchen, Hannah was preparing breakfast with Sarah sitting at the table, drawing intently in a notebook. The domestic scene seemed surreal amid the chaos their lives had become. I hope you don't mind, Hannah said, noticing his presence. I found coffee in the cupboard. The coffee had been there so long it might have come to life, Richard joked, trying to ease the tension from the previous night. Mommy makes the best coffee in the world, Sarah declared without taking her eyes off her drawing, even better than Grandma's. The innocent comment brought a smile to Hannah's lips, but her eyes remained worried. I managed to get Sarah to sleep a bit more, but we need to decide our next steps. Richard nodded, pouring himself a cup of the surprisingly good coffee. I've already tried to contact Judge Marina. I left a message with her office for an urgent meeting. And until then? Until then, we need to be strategic, Richard replied, lowering his voice so Sarah wouldn't hear. Victor isn't stupid. He'll start looking for the documents as soon as he discovers you've left the apartment. As if to confirm his words, Hannah's cell phone vibrated. She looked at the screen and paled. It's from the gallery. Adriana, my assistant. She says men from management are there reviewing all the files. They're looking for documents related to old transactions. Richard frowned. They're desperate. That's both good and bad. Good because it means the evidence we have is really important. Bad because they won't give up easily, Hannah completed. Uncle Richard, Sarah's voice interrupted the tense conversation. Both adults were surprised by the familiar treatment the girl had naturally adopted. Can I show you my drawing? Richard approached, grateful for the distraction. On the paper, Sarah had drawn 3 stick figures, 2 big and 1 small, all smiling in front of what looked like a building. It's you, Mommy, and me, she explained proudly. In our new home. Hannah and Richard exchanged a meaningful look. Sarah's innocence made everything both more difficult and more important. It's beautiful, sweetheart, Richard managed to say, feeling a lump in his throat. The landline phone in the apartment rang, making everyone jump. Richard answered cautiously. Mr. Morgan? A familiar voice sounded on the other end. This is Carmen, from Judge Marina Alvarez's office. She can see you today at 2 p.m., but she asked me to let you know that she only has 30 minutes. I'll be there, Richard replied, his heart racing. And, Carmen, tell her it's about the artisan case. There was a significant pause. I see. In that case, she suggests you use the side entrance to the courthouse. It's more discreet. After hanging up, Richard turned to Hannah. We have a chance, but we need to be careful. Judge Marina is known for her integrity, but also for her caution. We need to present the evidence irrefutably." Hannah nodded, already in motion. "I'll organize the main documents and prepare a timeline." Alexander was meticulous. Each accusation has at least 3 different types of supporting evidence. "And what about Sarah?" Hannah stopped, biting her lip. "I can't leave her alone, but taking her to the courthouse—" "Mrs. Johnson," Richard said suddenly, "we can trust her. She can stay with Sarah during the meeting." "I don't know." Hannah hesitated. "Mommy," Sarah interrupted again, showing wisdom beyond her years. "I can stay with Mrs. Johnson. You said we need to be brave like Daddy was, remember?" Hannah hugged her daughter tightly, silent tears running down her face. Richard looked away, giving them privacy in that moment. The next few hours were of intense preparation. Hannah organized documents while Richard made strategic calls using a prepaid phone. They couldn't risk using their normal cell phones. Not after Hannah discovered a suspicious app installed on her device. Around noon, Mrs. Johnson arrived, bringing with her an aura of tranquility that everyone needed. Sarah immediately took to her, especially after the lady pulled out a package of homemade cookies from her bag. "Go do what you need to do, Mrs." Johnson assured them, as Sarah was already exploring her sewing box. "This little one is safe with me." When they finally left the apartment, Hannah carrying the folder with selected documents and Richard keeping the flash drive in his jacket's inner pocket, both felt the weight of the responsibility they carried. "You can still back out," Richard offered one last time as they waited for the taxi they had called from a distant location. Hannah adjusted the dark glasses she wore as a disguise. "No, I can't. Alexander didn't give up, even knowing the risks. I won't dishonor his memory by having less courage than he did." The taxi arrived, and as they got in, Richard noticed a black car parked a few blocks down. It could be a coincidence, but his years in the business world had taught him that coincidences rarely existed when big interests were at stake. "Driver," he said, "can you take a few detours before heading to the destination? I want to show the city to my friend from out of town." The taxi driver shrugged, turning on the meter. Beside him, Hannah gently squeezed his hand, a silent gesture of understanding and gratitude. They were in this together now, for better or worse. The courthouse imposed respect with its imposing architecture. Richard and Hannah entered through the side entrance as instructed, being greeted by Carmen, Judge Marina's assistant. The middle-aged woman led them through less crowded corridors until they reached a discreet meeting room, away from the spotlight of the main building. Judge Marina Alvarez was seated at the head of the oval table, her gray hair perfectly arranged and her sharp eyes observing every movement of the newcomers. Richard felt like a law student again, facing his most demanding professor. "Richard Morgan," she said, her voice maintaining that same authoritative tone he remembered from classes. "I must admit I was intrigued by your request for a meeting, and even more so when they mentioned the artisan case." "Thank you for seeing us, Your Honor," Richard replied, maintaining the formal tone. "This is Hannah Hayes Dumont, Alexander, Hayes's widow." A flash of recognition passed through the judge's eyes. "Ah, yes, the gallery owner's case. An interesting loss." Hannah straightened in her chair, placing her folder on the table. "Judge Alvarez, what we have to show goes far beyond a simple case of business succession. Alexander left specific evidence that should reach your hands." Marina leaned slightly forward. "And why mine specifically?" "Because you're known for your integrity," Richard intervened, "and because Alexander knew we would need someone with enough courage to face some of the most powerful men in New York." "Interesting," Marina commented, adjusting her reading glasses. "Show me what you have." For the next half hour, Hannah methodically presented the evidence gathered by Alexander: inflated contracts, duplicate invoices, records of secret meetings, all pointing to a sophisticated money laundering scheme through the art market. "The pattern is clear," Hannah explained, pointing to a series of documents. Artworks were overvalued through a network of co-opted appraisers and experts. Morgan Developments, under Victor Sanders' direction, made large cultural investments through these galleries, and the money came back clean through phantom real estate investments, the judge completed, her eyes quickly scanning the documents. "Ingenious. and completely illegal. There's more, Richard added, taking the flash drive from his pocket. Alexander maintained a recording system in his gallery. We have a specific meeting that... A knock on the door interrupted his speech. Carmen entered hurriedly, her normally composed face showing signs of concern. I'm sorry, Your Honor, but there's a situation. Mr. Michael Harris is here insisting on speaking with you. He says it's about an urgent case of public interest. Judge Marina showed no surprise. How long has he been here? Approximately 10 minutes, ma'am. And I imagine he's not alone. No, ma'am. He's accompanied by Mr. Victor Sanders and 2 other lawyers. A tense silence fell over the room. Hannah paled slightly but maintained a firm posture. Richard felt his heart race. They had been followed despite their precautions. Carmen, the judge spoke with studied calm, inform Mr. Harris that I'm in an important meeting about the artisan case. I'm sure he'll understand the significance of that. After Carmen left, Marina turned to Hannah and Richard. You have exactly 15 minutes to show me what's on that flash drive. After that, things are going to get complicated. Richard connected the device to the laptop the judge provided. The recording showed an apparently casual meeting at the Artisan Gallery after hours. Victor Sanders, Michael Harris, and 2 other well-known businessmen were openly discussing how to clean a new batch of investments. We need to speed up the process. Victor's voice sounded clear in the recording. Morgan is starting to ask inconvenient questions, and that damn gallery owner, Hayes, is poking around where he shouldn't. Leave Hayes to me, Harris's voice replied. I have some interesting information about some medications he keeps at home. Judge Marina raised her hand, stopping the playback. Her face had hardened, and her eyes shone with an intensity that Richard remembered well from his college days. It was the look she had when she found an injustice that needed to be corrected. I received an anonymous tip 3 months ago, she revealed, surprising both of them, about irregularities in the art market and possible connections to money laundering, but I had no concrete evidence until now. And what happens now? Hannah asked, her voice betraying a slight tremor. Marina stood up, her posture emanating authority. Now you're going to leave through that door and follow Carmen. She'll take you to my private car in the back of the building. My driver has instructions to take you to a safe location. And you? Richard questioned. A thin smile appeared on the judge's lips. I'm going to do what I do best. I'm going to receive Mr. Harris and his companions, and I'm going to remind them why some call me the Lioness of the Court. Before they left, Marina held Hannah's arm. Your husband was a brave man, Mrs. Hayes. He made the right choice in trusting this evidence to you, and you made the right choice in bringing it to me. In the corridor, following Carmen hurriedly, Richard and Hannah could hear raised voices coming from the direction of the main lobby. The hunt had begun, but for the first time since it all started, they were no longer the prey. They were key witnesses in a case that promised to shake the power structures in New York. The judge's car wound through the streets of New York, driven by a silent chauffeur who seemed to know exactly where to go without needing instructions. Hannah kept her eyes fixed on the window, observing the city she loved so much and that now seemed strangely hostile. Richard, beside her, tried to process the events of the last few hours. Where are we going? He finally asked the driver. St. Teresa's retreat house, the man responded succinctly. Judge's orders. Hannah turned to Richard, surprised. A retreat house? It's brilliant, actually, Richard commented, beginning to understand the strategy. It's a discreet location, run by nuns, with its own security. And most importantly, it has diplomatic protection because it's Vatican property. Richard's disposable cell phone vibrated. A message from Mrs. Johnson. Sarah is great. We made cookies and she's teaching me how to play Minecraft. Hannah visibly relaxed upon reading the message. Your friend is an angel, Richard. She was always more than an employee, he replied, putting the phone away. Sometimes we need to lose everything to value the right people in our lives. The car parked in front of an imposing gate, and an elderly nun greeted them with a serene smile. Welcome. I'm Sister Constance. Judge Marina has already informed us about you. The interior of the house was an oasis of tranquility amidst the chaos of the city. well-tended gardens, silent corridors, and an atmosphere of peace that seemed distant from the reality they faced. "You'll stay in the guest wing," Sister Constance explained, guiding them. "And don't worry, we have experience in receiving people who need discretion." They had barely settled in when the news on the TV in the communal room caught their attention. Breaking news: Judge Marina Alvarez orders search and seizure at Sanders Enterprises offices and freezing of accounts related to the group. The images showed federal agents entering the Enterprise Tower, the same building that once belonged to Richard's company. Victor Sanders appeared being led to give a statement, his normally composed face now marked by barely contained anger. "This is just the beginning," Richard murmured. "Victor has powerful connections, he won't fall alone." As if to confirm his words, the reception phone rang. Sister Constance answered and came to them with a concerned expression. "Judge Marina is on the phone. She needs to speak with you urgently." On the call put on speakerphone, the magistrate's voice sounded tense. "I just received an interesting visit from the Chief Justice. Apparently there's a movement to remove me from the case due to conflict of interest, citing my former relationship as Mr. Morgan's professor." "They can't do that," Hannah protested. "They can try," Marina replied dryly. "But don't worry, I've already notified the federal prosecutor's office. The evidence you brought is too solid to be ignored, even if I'm removed." "What about Sarah?" Hannah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I've already arranged police escort for her and Mrs. Johnson. They'll be brought there today. The retreat house has an excellent internal school, by the way." After hanging up, Richard and Hannah shared a moment of reflective silence in the house's inner garden. The soft sound of the fountain and the birdsong contrasted dramatically with the turbulence in their lives. "You know what's ironic?" Hannah commented, watching a butterfly land nearby. "Alexander always said that art had the power to reveal truth through beauty. He never imagined his own gallery would be used to cover up so much dirt." "Truth always finds a way," Richard responded, surprising himself with the depth of the reflection. "Sometimes it needs help to surface, but it always emerges." A group of nuns passed by them singing softly during their evening walk. The afternoon sun bathed the garden in golden tones, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. "Richard," Hannah said softly, "thank you for everything. You risked your safety to help two strangers." "You're not strangers," he interrupted. "Not anymore. And maybe I needed you as much as you needed me." The moment was interrupted by Sister Constance, who approached with a tablet in her hands. "You need to see this, it's on all the news portals." On the screen, explosive headlines followed one another. "Money laundering scheme through art market uncovered in New York." "Renowned businessmen are targets of federal operation." "Prosecutor's office investigates political connections in billion-dollar fraud." But it was one headline in particular that caught Richard's attention. "Former owner of Morgan Developments may have been victim of business conspiracy." "The truth is coming to light," Hannah whispered, holding Richard's hand. "Alexander would be proud." The sound of a helicopter flying over the house made everyone look up. Sister Constance smiled calmly. "Don't worry, our walls are high and our doors are strong, and besides," she made the sign of the cross with a serene expression, "we have higher protection." Richard watched the helicopter move away, thinking about how drastically his life had changed in just a few days. From a bankrupt and lonely ex-tycoon, he had transformed into a key piece in an investigation that promised to shake the structures of power. More importantly, he had found a new purpose and maybe, just maybe, a new family. Sarah's arrival at the retreat house brought new energy to the austere environment. The girl, with her contagious joy, quickly won the hearts of the high nuns, especially Sister Constance, who discovered in herself an unexpected vocation for telling children's stories. "Mommy, look! The sisters have a huge garden," Sarah exclaimed, running between the flower beds. "And they said I can help take care of the plants." Hannah watched her daughter with a mixture of relief and concern. It was amazing how children could adapt to new situations, transforming even a temporary refuge into an adventure. Richard, sitting on a nearby bench, was browsing the latest news on his tablet. The case was gaining ever larger proportions. New names emerged every hour, connections were revealed, and the empire Victor had built was beginning to show cracks. "There's something strange here," he commented, drawing Hannah's attention. "I'm reviewing the documents Alexander gathered, and there's a pattern we hadn't noticed before." Hannah sat down beside him, adjusting her glasses to examine the information. "What kind of pattern?" "The international transactions, and they didn't start with Morgan Developments. Victor was already making suspicious movements years before through other companies that, coincidentally, also went bankrupt." "Like yours," Hannah completed, understanding. "It wasn't the first time he did this. Not at all. I found at least 3 other cases in the last 10 years, successful businessmen who inexplicably lost everything after partnering with Victor. The difference is that Alexander was the only one who managed to gather evidence." The sound of hurried footsteps interrupted the conversation. Sister Constance was approaching, her usually serene countenance now marked by concern. "Judge Marina is on her way," she announced. "It seems there have been important developments." Minutes later, Marina Alvarez entered the garden accompanied by 2 federal agents. Her face showed fatigue, but her eyes maintained their determined shine. "We've gained access to Sanders Enterprises' servers," she announced without preamble. "And we've discovered something you need to see." On her laptop, Marina showed a series of old emails. The correspondence, dated 15 years ago, revealed a conversation between Victor and several international businessmen. The subject: how to create a global money laundering system through the art and real estate markets. "This is much bigger than we imagined," Marina explained. "Victor wasn't just a corrupt businessman. He was the contact point for an international organization. Morgan Developments would be just another company used in the scheme, just like the Artisan Gallery." "But Alexander discovered it," Hannah murmured. "Yes, and he did something brilliant. Instead of confronting Victor directly, he began methodically collecting evidence. Every transaction, every meeting, every document was catalogued and cross-referenced. He created such an intricate web of evidence that it would be impossible to dismantle." Richard felt a chill as he realized the genius of Alexander's plan. That's why he left such specific instructions about how and when the evidence should be revealed. "Exactly," Marina agreed. "He knew he needed time to gather enough evidence, and he knew he would need specific people to get this evidence to the right authorities." "What do you mean?" Hannah asked. "Think about it. He left the evidence with you, Hannah, because he knew you would seek out Richard, Victor's first victim who was still in a position to help. And he mentioned my name because he knew I had connections in both the judiciary and the federal prosecutor's office." The crystalline sound of Sarah's laughter echoed through the garden. The girl was now helping some nuns water the flowers, completely oblivious to the importance of the conversation happening a few meters away. "What happens now?" Richard questioned, his eyes fixed on the domestic scene in front of him. "Now we need to prepare," Marina responded. "Victor is cornered but still powerful. In the next 48 hours, he'll be called to testify to the federal police, and knowing him as I do, he's going to try to negotiate." "Negotiate?" Hannah became alarmed. "Plea bargain," Marina explained. "He's going to try to give up bigger names in exchange for benefits, but..." A subtle smile appeared on her lips. "He doesn't know we already have access to the entire network of connections. Any deal he tries to make will be insufficient." Bell rang in the distance, calling for evening prayer. Sister Constance approached again. "Excuse me for interrupting, but I thought you'd like to know. Sarah has been invited to join the children's choir. They have a performance on Sunday." Hannah felt tears forming in her eyes. Amidst all that chaos, her daughter was finding moments of pure joy. Richard instinctively held her hand, offering silent support. "Oh, and one more thing," Marina added, observing the gesture with interest. "Preliminary investigations have already confirmed Mr. Morgan's innocence in the Morgan Developments case. The process of reversing the bankruptcy should begin soon." Richard barely registered the news. His thoughts were focused on the small family that fate had placed in his path. The company, the fortune, the status, all of that now seemed secondary to the possibility of a true new beginning. "Shall we go watch the choir rehearsal?" he suggested, standing up and extending his hand to Hannah. She smiled, accepting the invitation. Together they walked towards the chapel. where Sarah's voice blended with that of other children in a hopeful melody. The afternoon sun, shining through the stained glass windows, created a play of colored lights that seemed to bless that moment of peace amidst the storm that had not yet ended. "Let's go home," Richard suggested softly. "Sarah must be waiting to tell us about her culinary adventures." Hannah smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. "Yes, let's go home. Our family is waiting." As they left the courthouse, the drizzle had given way to a timid sun that was beginning to break through the clouds. It was as if New York City itself was celebrating that moment of justice and renewal.